So I'm Ben. Thanks everybody for coming out. I'm going to talk about deploying a location-aware ember.js application. So the talk's going to be kind of split into two parts. The first of which is talking about ember-cli-deploy, which was sort of announced. It was 5 different projects that got merged into one and are now under the ember-cli-deploy project namespace. It's sort of the de facto way to deploy your ember.js application into production. And then I'm going to move on to showing how I've deployed a location-aware app, and we'll do some live coding and hope that stuff works. So we all know deployment can be really scary. It can be sort of the most stressful part of our job because your dev and staging environment doesn't always equal your production environment. Your data and servers can differ. You can have DB sharding and uglification and caching and latency and like all these other things that make your job hard, right? And you deploy, and then you're like, oh my god, I'm like super stressed out. Holy crap, I can't roll this back. Like, what do I do? And it can be the worst part of our job. We can be doing this. And us testing is better than users testing in prod. In fact, not just us, but our dev team, our QAs, stakeholders, the entire company testing in prod is better than me or my other fellow users testing in prod. That's sort of more like this than vacuuming out the fire. So enter ember-cli-deploy. This is one of the original project maintainers, Michael Klein, said it's lightning-fast deployments of ember-CLI apps, which I think sort of understates that it's easy, lightning-fast, sleep better at night deployments of your apps. So how does it work? At a high level, this is the ember-cli-deploy ecosystem. And I don't have a pointer. OK, so you have your development or your CI. So this could be Jenkins. This could be your machine. You're deploying your index.html file because with our single-page application, that's really the only thing that needs to bootstrap our application. That has our fingerprinted JavaScript and CSS files that say, this is my version that I want to deploy. So it puts that string into Redis. And I'll explain this a little bit more. It uploads our assets. So these are our fingerprinted JavaScript files, our CSS files, our images, our silly owl GIFs. Going through a CloudFront CDN or any other content distribution network, and eventually all being served to our client. So how does this work exactly? So you have someone on their laptop requesting example.org. They're talking to an app server, which could be Express or Koa or any sort of, could be Ruby on Rails. It could really be a number of different things. And it asks Redis, and it says, hey, what's current? What does the developer have deployed? And it'll say, oh, here's ABC123. This is the most current thing. And ABC123 is just our index HTML string that says this is our version. So it serves that up. Index.html gets downloaded onto their machine, and we pull the appropriate assets from our S3 bucket. And now when I want to deploy, I can say, OK, I've made some changes. I'm ready to deploy. I upload revision DEF456. But what's still happening when that person is requesting example.org, my website, it says, what's current? It says, oh, ABC123. And so what's great is I've done a deployment into production, but the average user is still just getting my previous website. But what I can do, because I know, because I'm the developer and I know that my special key is DEF456, I can put a secret query param at the end of my website that says example.org with a query param secret equals DEF456. That will override the current request and actually pull down my new version in production. So I can actually check everything out in production before anyone else sees it, which is great because if there's a problem with latency or DB sharding or any sort of issue, I can figure that out and say, okay, I need to get this fixed before I deploy it. And when I'm ready, I can say, cool, ember deploy activate DEF456. It switches out my current symlink, and then when people request example.org, they get my new website. And then if I'm like, oh my god, holy crap, I screwed up, there's something I didn't see, I can always ember deploy activate ABC123, and then everything is reverted back, and everything just sort of works, and you can sleep better at night. Ron and I actually did this today. we deployed something.
Unfortunately, after we tested it in production.
Right, so we tested it in production, we activated it, and one of our developers was like, this is wrong. We're like, you're right. So we activated the previous version, didn't stress out, fixed the problem, did another deployment, activated it, and I haven't gotten a page since I've been sitting here, so I think everything's good. So that at a high level is how ember-cli-deploy works, how it sort of makes our lives easier. So let's take a look at a demo project and kind of see how this can work in real life. So let's say that I have an application and I have a bunch of users in Mexico and a bunch of users in the United States. And instead of asking them, hey, where are you? And choosing their language, which kind of sucks, when they request from a computer connected to the internet in Mexico, they have an IP address that can easily be geocoded to say, I'm in Mexico. And then our server can say, yep, this is a Mexican user. We should, by default, show them a Spanish website. So you're probably wondering, okay, I've got this index string in Redis, and I'm serving it down to the user. How the heck am I going to tell Ember this user is in Mexico? Well, there's this handy library that I wrote called ember-cli-server-variables, which can take an embedded variable in your index.html page, read that out, and then in your Ember application, you can get this value of mx and say, okay, this user's in Mexico, what language should I serve them? So the client stack, I'm using EmberJS 1.12, Ember I18N. If you're not familiar with that syntax, it's because internationalization is a really, really long word, and there's 18 letters between I and N, so I18N. ember-cli-deploy with the Redis and S3 adapters, and then ember-cli-server-variables. So let's look at some code. So this is my config environment.js. With any new ember-cli application, you're going to get an environment.js file. And a lot of this stuff, like, well, the only thing in this example is the module prefix. That's sort of auto-generated for you by ember-cli. But the rest of this stuff is read in by ember-cli-server-variables. And it says, every tag that I want you to pay attention to starts with the term var. If you don't provide that, it's going to expect everything to start with location-where-ember- my variable, which was too long, so I just called it var. And then I say, hey, you should expect a variable named country to be in there. And in development, because I'm probably not going to be running my node server and having Redis running locally and like all that crazy stuff, when I'm testing, just default that to the US because I speak English best and that's what I'm going to use. So then when we first start up, we use a service like Kyle showed us. This time it's a session, and in most applications you're probably going to have a session service. This is a great example of when you could use a service. Session level information that needs to live for the lifetime that user is using our app, which in this case, country code, I doubt that they're going to connect in Mexico and then within the same session they're going to somehow end up in the United States and change their country code. And I provide this force initialization function here, which gets the country out of the server variable service and sets it on the service. So this is how you actually do the Ember inject service if you didn't want to do an initializer like Kyle showed. This is sort of the automagical Ember syntax. If you don't provide a parameter, it's going to look for a service called server variables. But if you wanted to call it foobar-baz server variables, you could pass in Ember inject service server variables, and then it would inject that, and then I can access anything in that service. It's provided by the ember-cli-server-variables library. And so when I first start up my application, I'm going to have my I18N service, my session service. This is kind of why I like injecting the service this way, because in my application route, I can see all the services I depend on, which is kind of handy, as opposed to having an initializer. And when I first start up, I'm going to set the I18N locale to language for country code, get country code. So remember, country code is US, MX, JP for Japan. And then I just wrote this really simple utility method that switches for languages that I know. So if you're in Spain or Mexico, we'll default to Spanish. If you're in the UK, which their country code is GB, or US, return English, and then we'll just default to English if we don't have another translation, because I don't I'm not going to pretend to know Japanese, so I didn't do a Japanese translation. And then we have our translations files for IETN, where I have my home greeting, hello, thank you for visiting from country name. So we'll actually put the country name inside of the translation and the Spanish version of the exact same thing. So then in my template, I've got I'm using Foundation, so I've got rows and text center and that kind of thing. But the key part is that I've got home.greeting, home.secondary greeting, and I pass in and bind the country name in here. So it'll say, thank you for visiting from your country name. So let's take a look at that working. Oh no, I've lost my window. Sorry. And of course, Heroku's booting up because I'm cheap and I didn't pay for the fancy version, and I haven't hit it in a minute. So, hello, thank you for visiting from the United States. So it's detected that Ciro's IP address is in the United States, and it's going to load up the English translation by default. But how exactly is it doing that? Let's take a look at the server. So, like I said, I'm using Heroku and Heroku Redis, which is pretty handy because it's a super easy way to get a Redis store where ember-cli-deploy is going to load up our current keys and our index HTML strings, and it's free. Our server tech...
Until like December.
Until December, and I will shut down. So you have until December to look at location-aware ember.herokuapp.com. Express 4 I'm using on the server. It's a node.js technology. You can use all of these libraries you could use with another node technology if you wanted to. I originally was going to write this in Koa, but then generators blew my mind and I didn't do it. geoip-lite is the library I'm using to detect for 127.0.0.1, insert your IP address here, what country is it in. I'm using the Redis plugin to pull our index HTML string out. I'm using Cheerio, which I'll show you guys. It's a cool library that pulls in an HTML string, and then you can act with it like jQuery, which is how I'm injecting the server variable. And then I'm using node ember-cli-deploy Redis because I got tired of writing the same code all the time, so I'm open sourcing this tonight. It's a way to really easily pull out your index HTML strings out of ember-cli-deploy Redis. So let's take a look at some code. So here's the base index.js. So when a request comes into my Express server, it goes down and it says, okay, what paths do I know about? What should I serve this user now that they're asking for this, this path? So when they get anything, because it's a pretty boring app and all it does is serve up one thing, I go into node ember-cli-deploy Redis and I say, hey, fetch this index. I called my application aware ember in my module prefix, so that's what the key is prefixed with in Redis. Here's the request that came in, and the client is actually the Redis client that it can do to interact with the DB. Once I get that index.html, this is promise syntax where it's a .then. On success, I get my index.html. I inject my server variables into it. I send a 200 and render the page. And if it fails, I send a 500 and just say oh no's and kind of throw my hands up. Your app should probably do something better than that. So when I inject my server variable, I use that library called Cheerio to load up my HTML string that I pull out of Redis. And then I grab my server variable country, and I set its content to the country that I'm getting out of the request. So for that IP address, what country is this request coming from? And then I return .html, which spits it out as an HTML string that Express can render to the page. So in location helper, I take in my request object, and I take the IP address, I geocode it with geoip.lookup, and then I return the country that I get if it has a country. If it's an IP block that doesn't have a country, I'm just like, oh, I don't know, say they're in the United States. This X-forwarded for thing is actually kind of interesting. So what Heroku does is it actually, all of the requests seem to come in from a 10.10 IP block because they do internal load balancing. So they set a header that says X-forwarded for, and they say this is the IP address of the original person who accessed this. So when I was originally making this talk, I was like, why the hell am I always in the United States when I have a Mexican IP address with my VPN? And they loved that. And it was because I needed to check this X-forwarded for. So let's take a look at it running in prod, but using a different IP address. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect using, I use an app called Private Internet Access. So when I'm in Starbucks and I'm connected to their unsecured Wi-Fi, I can connect to a secure location. So I've just connected through a Mexican IP address. So if I look at what is my IP, I've got this 167.570.215, which is somewhere in Mexico. So if I refresh my page, I'm going to see, okay, this user's in Mexico. It's geocoded my IP address to say MX. My app has initialized the session to say this person is in Mexico. My locale util has said people in Mexico should see the Spanish version of the website first. And it's selecting the correct locale now and using the translated file. But I'm going to disconnect my VPN here. Sorry, I should have put the toolbar over so you could see me connecting. But let's say we now get a feature request. And they're like, OK, this is really cool. But what if I live in the United States and I speak Spanish? So I want to change my locale in real time. It's actually really easy. So here's the diff to do that. This is in my template in index.hbs. I'm going to set 2 anchors that just send an action up called setLanguage. So I'm going to accept the action setLanguage, and I'm going to expect a parameter of the locale that you want to switch to, so en or es. So here's where I actually catch that action. And I'm going to actually catch it in application.js because instead of, you could want to change your location from anywhere in the application. So I could have accepted it in the index.js route, but let's say you wanted to implement a modal on a sub-page that fires this action. We want you to be able to change it from anywhere. And again, we inject our service, and then we just set the locale on it. So I'm going to actually do a live deploy. So let's take a look at our deploy configuration. All I need to pass to it is my build environment for ember-cli-deploy. This says fingerprint all my assets for production. My store, which is on S3, this is my my Redis database. That's the location of my Redis DB, the port it expects to connect on, and in case you wanted to mess with me, I've hidden my Redis password. I'm using something called .env. It's basically a file that you don't check into your source code management and you keep separately, so you never expose your secret keys. And you'll notice that I use that too for my S3 secret access key, so you guys can't put a bunch of junk in my location-aware Ember bucket. So really, really simple to get this set up. You just have to create an access key, an S3 bucket, and use Redis. You can use Amazon Web Services or Heroku Redis or really whatever you want. So let's do a deployment. So that is my server. So in location-aware Ember, I'm going to check out, because I'm scared of live coding, I'm going to check out v4, which is that diff that I showed you. And I'm just going to Ember deploy to production. So luckily, by default, you have to tell it, I want to deploy to production, so you're not just like, oh, I'm deploying to staging, and you accidentally deploy to production. Even though your users wouldn't see it, they'd have to use your secret access code. You do have to provide the environment.
Did you use the text access a little bit?
Yes. Excellent. So right now it's building. ember-cli is the build tool that it uses by default. So because it has to do fingerprinting, it's a little bit slow to do the initial build. But okay, great. So it's built the application. It's uploaded index.html into my Redis store, and it's uploaded any assets that have changed in my S3 bucket. And it's like, cool, I've got your location-aware Ember, BE526E6, and in case you're wondering what the hell is that, it's actually my GitHub commit at that time. So you can see exactly what's deployed in production at that very moment in time, which is pretty handy. So I've got this key, and remember I can apply a secret key. So if I just access my site, I'm still seeing the old version without the feature request, which is great, because if I mess something up, no one else will see it except me. So then I can do index key equals that key. This will force Redis to use my new version. And so here's my feature request where I can live change my language. And if I realized, holy crap, this isn't working right, no one else has seen it except me. But if I decide, okay, cool, I've got my change language in Spanish and in English, that looks really good, I can activate it. So I can do ember-deploy activate on production, revision, my previous revision. They're adding a my last uploaded shortcut, which I'm like extremely excited about. So I can say deploy that revision, switch over the key. So it'll say, cool, I've activated. Now I can take my index key off, and all users are seeing my new version. So this is really, really extremely powerful. I highly, highly recommend if you're doing any sort of application where you're worried if you mess something up for users, highly, highly recommend using something like this. Thanks for your attention. I know it was really long, but I hope it was useful. This is where you can find me on all the things. I'm on GitHub at Limmer, on Twitter at Lims, hello at Ben Limmer, and I just got ember.party, so check out ember.party. Also, these slides are on SlideShare. I'll tweet it out and I'll post it on the meetup group. All of these demo projects are on GitHub, so if you want to take a look at them, they're all 100% tested. So if you're curious about unit testing, unit and acceptance testing, these both the server and the client are 100% unit tested. So take a look at those, and there's other resources on here. I'm happy to take any questions you guys might have. Yeah.
How does the image assets change? Are they all on the same fingerprint? If you have
Yeah, good question. So the question was, how does the fingerprinting work? So on S3, it'll actually, ember-cli-deploy will keep the last 10 revisions of your code out there. And so if you have foo.png, and foo.png hasn't changed in the past 10 revisions, great, that's going to remain cached. So you can, it's going to be foo-fingerprint.png. And if every version of your app is still referring to foo-that same fingerprint, it'll remain cached, so it's really, really fast. But if your last revision, you changed foo as foo-def456.png, both of those versions will be on S3, and your new version will request the new fingerprinted asset. So it only breaks the cache when it has to.
What's your backend stack at Ibotta?
We use, so our API is Ruby on Rails, and then we actually use Express and the node ember-cli-deploy Redis. That was something that I was gonna copy paste out of our source code, and I was like, I should just open source this. So that's pretty much exactly what we use at Ibotta.
Very cool. So how come? What's the division between the node and the Ruby?
Yeah, good question. So we have an entire team that works on our platform team. The Ruby on Rails code base serves our mobile application, our data warehouse, our website. So it didn't make sense to move everything over to Express. So really all our Express does is handles some the geoip location, because we use geoip location to say, but more specifically, so we can say, we think Ian requesting this website is in Denver, so show him offers available in Colorado in the Denver metro area. So we use exactly the geoip-lite project, and then it's just basically a dumb web server essentially.
When we switched over to use ember-cli-deploy, we considered actually moving the web server backend into Ruby alongside all the rest of the platform. But Fastboot is going to be supported as a node middleware. So we were like, oh no, we'll stick with Express for that purpose.
Does everybody know what Fastboot is when we're talking about Fastboot? So for those of you who aren't familiar with Fastboot, it's really awesome. Basically what it's going to do is it's going to run Phantom.js on your Express server to pre-render the page. So you can actually curl an Ember website and get back the HTML code. And if it is a JavaScript-enabled browser, it'll rehydrate it. So the initial page load is super, super fast. You're not downloading all this giant JavaScript payload that is Ember right away. You can get your users in, see some content. Most importantly, bots can see your content. And then it rehydrates to become a full-featured single-page application. That's landing supposedly June 12th. Right now with Ember 1.12 or 1.13, you can use fastboot as an alpha plugin, which I have not been courageous enough to try yet.
What's the state of ember-cli-deploy? Like, where is it at?
Good question. So ember-cli, his question was, what's the state of ember-cli-deploy? So right now, the current release is 0.4.1. After they merged at EmberConf, all the different projects that were sort of doing the same thing, they released this idea of having a deploy pipeline. So it would be really, really easy. So if you don't want to use Redis and you don't want to use S3 and you want to use cloud-based and something else, like there are adapters that you can deploy your Ember app to pretty much anything else. S3 and Redis are the most popular, but they've come up with this idea of a pipeline where it's really easy to hook into before and after deploy. So it's going to make it really great for the adapter ecosystem. So I want to identify New Relic when I push out a new deploy. It's going to be super easy to write an add-on to do that with pipeline. All of that stuff is landing in 0.5, which was a little bit behind schedule. I think it's about a month behind, but there's a great PR open where they're constantly working on it. So 0.5 is really going to be sort of the next big release of ember-cli-deploy, and they're going to be, I know the Redis and S3 adapters are pretty much compatible with it as is, but other adapters might be a little off. So if you run into that, you're using Firebase or something else, take a look at it. You might have to use 0.4.1 for a little while until it comes up to 0.5. But it's under the ember-cli GitHub, so it's github.com/ember-cli/ember-cli deploy. So it's something that will be maintained. This isn't like a one-off thing.
It seems like it would make it pretty trivial to like try out or switch services for any of that kind of stuff because they have a sale that month or like anything.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, it's super flexible. I'm really impressed with these guys. They've done an amazing job at trying to think through, well, what if this person wants to use this or that? They're sort of supporting Redis as S3 as the main one because I think that's what they're using at their jobs. But overall, they've done a really impressive job at trying to say, bring your own NoSQL DB and bring your own asset bucket and bring your own CDN with cloud, whether it be CloudFront or something else, and it'll sort of just work TM. Any other questions? Again, all this is available. I'll be around for a little bit if you guys have more questions. Thanks.